Welcome, everybody, to the Playing with Fire podcast. I'm your host, Brian Spitolsky, an ex-firefighter and current fire investigator. We are going to talk about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The only reason I'm bringing this up is it's a historical fire that was very devastating. But as I looked into this, I discovered some very interesting information regarding fire department actions, the city of San Francisco, what they attempted to do with Chinatown. It just became a grabbing research project for me. So I kind of want to throw this out there for you guys as one of the things we talked about when we first started the podcast is pulling in historical fires. But let's go into the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco just because it is so interesting in how the fire department responded to it, what their difficulties were, and I thought ingenious method of trying to control the fire. Although initially it didn't work very well, it caused the fire to spread, but we'll get into that a little bit. But this is the spirit of the firefighter, is doing what you can with what you got. And that has been a theme for many, many incidents where you don't have everything you need, but you work with what you got. So the San Francisco earthquake started on April 18th at about 5:12 in the morning. It shook for about 45 seconds and it was recorded at that time as a 7.9. There was massive damage throughout the city. As you guys probably all know, there were many fires. 400,000 citizens were displaced because of the earthquake. There's a difference in how many people died in the research. So the city put down that there was only about 638 people that died. There was concern that other people coming back after the earthquake were going to see a massive toll, a death toll, and then find that disheartening and not come back to the city. So there's many people that say over 3,000. That's why I believe there was a lot more than 600 people that died in that earthquake. The earthquake right off the bat decapitated the fire department. Chief Sullivan and his wife were killed when a chimney from a theater next door to the fire station that they were at fell onto the fire station and killed them. So right off the bat, the chief being dead hinders the fire department right from the beginning. One of the problems, obviously, was that they didn't have the water mains to all of the hydrants. Some still worked, but most of them were destroyed. So they didn't have water to support the fire department or the firefighting functions of trying to put these fires out. So the fires obviously grew and continued to grow. One of the things that happened early on was that the Army was brought in and the Navy, but the Army was brought in from a couple of different forts that are in the area. The Presidio came in, the Fort Hercules came in, and they started to help the firefighters with the firefighting functions. There were many aftershocks, obviously, that continued to cause damage to the city. Right now, what the records show is there was $350 million worth of damage. Today, that would be 8.9 billion. I think that that's a little bit undercut. I think it would be more than that if you looked at the photographs that do exist showing the city and how it was devastated. I would think it was a little bit higher than that, but that's what they've got it down as. So one of the things the fire department decided to do, since they did not have water, was they thought they would blow things up. Meaning, as a fire's progressing, wind driven through a neighborhood, the downtown financial district of San Francisco, the only way they figured they could stop the fire from progressing is by blowing up the buildings that are in the path of the fire. The first fault they did is that they didn't give enough time for the building that they were blowing up to be not on fire. They were working way too close to the fire. So it created a couple of issues. One, when the building blew up, it spread the fire. They were using dynamite, black powder, things that really went boom, but they weren't doing it far enough away from the fire. So the building would explode, the fire would spread, and now they've got fire in different areas instead of just in front of them. Now it's around them and behind them. So they had to spend a lot of time trying to perfect this method. Unfortunately, it took them a day and a half to do that, to where they switched to just using dynamite instead of black powder, because black powder, as it explodes, it's burning. The dynamite is the only thing that's burning is the building in front of it, where the black powder itself is burning. So the Army was bringing over shells and black powder that they use for their artillery. And that's where the initial supply of explosives came from. So then they refined it and started to use a different explosive. I found a couple of entries into a journal that the fire department had done. These were actual firefighters. Most of them are from captains, and one was from an assistant chief. I'm going to read a couple of these because I found them very interesting, because it's coming from the perspective of the actual people on the street fighting the fire or blowing up the buildings. So this one says, in the afternoon, we met civilians hauling boxes of dynamite and also fuses and caps in a buggy. And with this, we attempted to check the progress of the fire by dynamiting both sides of Langton Street between Folsom and Harrison Street. This also was unsuccessful, as we had no water to extinguish the flames, which originated after dynamiting. So this is one of the first entries talking about how the fire spread, because they blew up something and it made the fire go to different areas. And now they've got multiple fires instead of the one just in front of them. That is from a Captain T.J. Murphy, Engine Company number 29. So here's another entry on April 18th. It says, after this, we were ordered to fight the fire, which was then raging in the vicinity of Hayes and Gogue Streets. But by the time we reached the fire, there were 2 complete blocks that were on fire. After a long, hard fight, we found that we were making very little headway due to the scarcity of water. The fire was spreading rapidly in all directions, and in a last effort to check the spreading of the flames, dynamite was used. This was from a Captain Carew, Truck Company number 7. There isn't really an organization, a flow from a chief telling them how to do this. These are guys that are doing this on their own. They're kind of seeing or hearing, hey, they're using dynamite over there. Let's do the same thing here. There wasn't the communication going on. So these guys are taking it on themselves to do this and struggling after they do it to mitigate, trying to stop the fire, and they're actually causing the fire to spread. So here's another one. This will probably be the last one I'll read. At 12:30 a.m. on April 19th, we received word that there was water at 14th and Folsom Street, but we were unable to take the corner at once on account that dynamiting was still going on in the vicinity under the command of Colonel Walter Kelly, which is an Army guy. He's with the 1st Regiment National Guard, California. After they had dynamited 5 buildings in the vicinity, we connected to the hydrant on the southwest corner of 14th and Folsom Street. But on the account of the fierceness of the fire then raging in the buildings, which were dynamited, we were compelled to retreat to the hydrant in the middle of the block at west side of Folsom Street between 14th and 15th Street. It just blows my mind. This is from a Captain Radford, Engine Company number 25. The chaos that must have been going on in San Francisco downtown. It's dark now, so the fires are illuminating the sky. You've got buildings completely on fire. You've got Army personnel blowing up buildings while the firefighters are trying to fight the fire with what limited supplies of water that they had. I found it very fascinating how the firefighters took it to the level that they could. They had very little water, so they're blowing things up. What water they had, they were fighting 2 elements. They're fighting the Army, who were blowing up buildings, and they're fighting the fire. So it just goes to show the strength of a firefighter's mind, in my opinion. And although it didn't work initially, they had problems with it. They kept at it, and they decided to use different types of explosives and to give more space. In the end, it really was Mother Nature that stopped this fire. The wind direction shifted, the streets that are laid out became fire breaks. So the attempt of blowing up the city or blowing up buildings to stop the spread actually caused more fires. And probably caused more damage to the city than had they just let some of these buildings burn. Most of the destruction of the city was attributed to the fires, since widespread practice by the insureds were to burn their buildings down because they weren't covered by earthquake. They were covered by fire. So to have damage to your house and then to understand my house isn't covered by earthquake, but it is covered by fire. Mysteriously, a lot of these houses started on fire, which created all these little pockets of fire all over the city and made it a little bit more difficult to control it. There was a Captain Leonard D. Wildman of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. He reported that he was stopped by a fireman who told him that people in the neighborhood were firing their houses. They were told they would not get insurance on the buildings damaged by the earthquake unless there was damage by the fire. So you got these people now in this city that's burning, and they're contributing to the fire storm that's now happening because they want their insurance. They want their building to be covered, which again just adds to the complexity of the firefight, because you would think in a normal fire, you can kind of see where the fire's going to go. You might have spot fires, you might have exposures, but you wouldn't expect 10 blocks over where the wind's not blowing for a fire to start there in the middle of the block. Now, you have gas leaks that are going on and stuff like that, but this was people purposefully setting their houses on fire, which is just crazy. During the 19th, late on the 18th, early part of the 19th, the evacuations were taking place. The Army was trying to get people out. The Mayor Schmitz, he issued a proclamation that the federal troops, the members of the regular police force, and all special police officers have the authority by me to kill any and all persons found engaged in looting or in the commission of any other crime. Wow. This is beyond martial law. I just look at this as the massive chaos that must have been going on in the city, the great city of San Francisco, and the level of chaos for a mayor to throw this out there, because we've all experienced these towns that have been looted and rioted, and just imagine it on an entire city of 500,000, and they've all gone berserk. Well, not all of them obviously would be looting, but there's a massive amount of looting to where the mayor decided he is going to give the authority to shoot and kill anybody that's involved in any kind of crime. So there were over 4,000 federal troops. They brought in the soldiers from, like I said, the Presidio and over in Hercules, which is a little town across the bay, kind of by Oakland. They bring them in and they assisted the firefighters and the police officers in their regular duties. So one of the other things I found interesting, because it kind of relates back to the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake that dropped the Bay Bridge. One of the decks of the Bay Bridge fell, but one of the things that was done is a boat was brought in and was pumping water up the Marina District so that the firefighters had water. Because again, in that earthquake, 1989, a lot of the water mains had broke and they had problems in supplying water to a certain area, which the Marina District really burned a lot. But back in 1906, they brought in some of the boats that were in the bay, the Navy boats, to start supplying water. But when the dynamite ran low, the Army general in charge decided, we're going to take those boats, shoot them across the bay to go get some more dynamite, and stopped the firefighting that was going on just to get more explosives. Some of the stuff, the battles that were going on in the city were not just the firefighting, but it was also between the military and the civilian leadership and the firefighters and the military. So it kind of became just this massively chaotic experience. And to have just been somebody standing on the corner during this earthquake, I think would have been amazing to report on it, write down the notes, and just to see everything going on, or to be able to fly a drone over it. Obviously can't do that. But the other thing I found super interesting was the history of Chinatown. Now, back in 1906, Chinatown was kind of an interesting part of San Francisco that a lot of people other than the Chinese avoided, because they felt that the Chinese were substandard. They felt there was a lot of disease there. So they kind of stayed away from Chinatown, other than maybe the tourists that were coming in. But they felt that Chinatown was okay to burn. Most of Chinatown, if not every single building, burned down. 25,000 people living in the Chinatown area were evacuated out of there. Now, two things came out of this fire that were beneficial for the Chinese population. One of them was all of the records for those people that were born in San Francisco burned up. So there was a massive run to the records department for San Francisco after the fire by all these Chinese saying, I was born in San Francisco. My records burned up. I am a citizen. I need paperwork. And most of them got it. It took the government a little while to catch on to it, but there were estimates that were done. If the claims were true, each Chinese woman living in San Francisco, Chinatown, would had to have given birth to 500 children. Just crazy. The other thing is, like I was saying, that Chinatown was kind of left to burn out. And unfortunately, not everybody was evacuated from Chinatown as the fires were happening and as the explosions were taking place from the dynamite. And there were descriptions of the Chinese in the buildings that were blown up by the dynamite, that they were still in the building at the time of the explosion. And it's a little bit graphic in how they described the explosions and the bodies in there. So afterwards, the city of San Francisco actually wanted to move Chinatown across the bay. They didn't want Chinatown in San Francisco anymore because, again, they felt that it was a armpit. It wasn't what they wanted to rebuild the city. So the Chinese government ended up getting involved because the property in Chinatown belonged to the Chinese population. And they were getting upset that the city of San Francisco wasn't going to let them repopulate there, which was their property. So after a bunch of arguments, they decided, okay, yeah, we're going to let you guys stay in San Francisco. Chinatown was completely rebuilt. Almost every single building was rebuilt. At the end of all of this, there were some stats that were given. They had figured that some of the temperatures in the downtown area, because of the inferno, reached up to 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. If you think about a fire inside of a building, I can see getting some of those temperatures depending on the fuels that are burning. But on the streets around the city, because the inferno was so big, that you were able to hit those temperatures is just mind-boggling. They also said that the smoke rose over 5 miles up into the sky. Like an earthquake, you expect some fires, but not like a volcano. This 5 miles up in the sky is massive. So in the end, it says over 28,000 buildings were consumed in what they call the Great Fire of San Francisco. They suggest that between 3,000 and 4,000 people were killed, and over 250,000 people were rendered homeless because of this earthquake. Now, there is a lot of research that's out there. There's different numbers, there's different points of view. They couldn't even agree on where the earthquake initially was. Some say that it was in the bay near Oakland. Others say it was outside of the Golden Gate Bridge. Not that it matters, but there were thousands of earthquakes leading up to the Great Earthquake, but they don't talk about exactly where they were. And that was before the new earthquake standards are in, the way that they study the earthquakes. I think that the way that the firefighters adapted to not having water as a resource, it took them a little while to learn. You have to give a little bit of space between the explosion and the fire so you're not spreading the fire. And it also took them a couple of days or a day and a half to figure out you don't use black powder. You have to use dynamite and other types of glycerin explosives. But they were resourceful. The firefighters were resourceful. The ability to overcome and adapt and to think outside of the box is one of the things that firefighters do best. That's why we have some of the greatest tools and some of the smartest minds are working on new ways of doing things. But doing things outside of the box and thinking outside of the box is one of our great traits, I think. I found this extremely interesting. It was very informative. I didn't know how bad the explosions caused the fire to spread. I knew from going through the academy, we talked about how dynamite was used in the 1906 earthquake. But until you start reading the historical documentation about it, you don't understand the difficulties of that process. So in the links, there will be some photographs. You guys can actually see very few photos, a lot of art renderings, but there are some photos that show so many buildings on the ground. And to know that most of those were done by the fire department and the dynamiting operations. One of the other things they learned besides using dynamite, not black powder, was you don't want to blow up a building that is metal and brick frame. They had extreme difficulty. The building didn't blow up and it just caused more damage. And then the fire was able to get into the building a lot easier. So they learned from this. The photographs are very descriptive. The historical documentation of people actually who witnessed it is very descriptive. I encourage you again to look at that. So we want to thank our sponsor on this one, Scott Buskey with Manning Buskey Forensics. Again, Scott is an electrical mechanical engineer that I've used over the years for my forensic fires that he has helped me with. We've recovered lots of money. We've figured out lots of different theories, and we were able to prove a lot of those theories because of what Scott's able to do. So if any of you are looking at getting an electrical mechanical engineer, I encourage you to grab Scott Buskey with Manning Buskey Forensics. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I hope it was interesting. I want to do more of these. We're going to go back into the PTSD stuff, but I thought this was kind of a good break, a historical fire that we kind of can look back at and look at the lessons learned and also how the firefighter mind works. And it seems today it still works the same way. So thank you again. Like, subscribe, and we will talk to you on the next one.